Welcome back, everyone. My name is Steven. I'm your true champion, and today we are going to be ranking, rating, sequencing, whatever you want to say, all the decks in the EX2 format for the Digimon TCG. We're currently in the middle of Ultimate Cup season here in the US for the Digimon TCG. We had one this past weekend and one on the following weekend. It's going to be absolutely crazy, and I'm so mad that I can't play in any of them. That being said, though, I've been paying attention to this format. I've been testing it a little bit myself, and I have a lot of opinions about some of the best and some of the worst decks in this format. So we're going to talk about all those today. If you guys are excited for this video, be sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click that bell with notifications so you know when my videos go live for you. And if you ever want to be a part of awesome live streams like this in the future, be sure to follow me over on Twitch, twitch.tv/TrueChampionSteven, link down below as always. With that said, let's hop over to the tier list and actually talk about what the best decks are and kind of what the worst decks are. All right, y'all, here we are at the actual tier list itself. Y'all have seen these before, but in case you have not, we have 4 tiers today. Tier 1, those are the best decks, the cream of the crop, the tier 1 decks. We have tier 1.5. These are basically the best decks in the format, but like they maybe take a bad matchup to the one in tier 1. They may be a little bit harder to use. Maybe they're not most likely to be represented in a big tournament or even most likely to win a big tournament. We have rogue decks, and the way that I've always described this is these are the decks where if everything goes their way, they're winning that tournament. I don't care what they fought against. If you're someone who knows what they're doing with this deck and you fight good matchups all day, you can win. And then finally, we have tier 2. These are quote unquote the worst decks on this list, but you guys know the way that I do tier lists, everything in my opinion is viable. It is totally possible to win with a tier 2 deck. It's just the hardest group of decks to win with out of the entire bunch. And with the new inclusion of EX2 Digital Hazard cards, we have a lot of decks to talk about. I have 20 different decks here on this list, and there's even more out there like crazy Lotmon Rush decks or Justimon Shenanigans or D-Brigade or Diehards, but these are the decks that I think you're most likely going to see in big events, and you're most likely to consider yourself when it comes to taking down a big event. The first sort of group of decks that I have for you, the purple deck in EX2. So the purple decks I have on here are Beelzemon, we've got Cherubi, Creepymon Turbo, aka like Demon Lords, and finally Mastemon. So lots of decks here in the purple color as always. I'm just gonna go ahead and put them where I'm feeling. I'm gonna go here, 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 and there. So first things first, Mastemon, I think it is the best purple deck right now. Being able to just have the walking floodgate and advantage engine that Mastemon is as soon as possible is always going to be strong. It was strong in BTA, it's going to be strong now. Even decks that you would think are bad matchups like D-Reaper or like any hybrid deck, you'd be surprised how Mastemon can just steamroll advantage, and having tons of ways to interact with your opponent's board, whether it's removal or tamer removal, is really good. Beelzemon and Creepymon / Demon Lord Turbo in Rogue, because originally these decks were like really good in BT8 because they were good against like yellow hybrid or stallier decks that tried to go to the late game. You could just deck them out with Creepy, or you could just straight up gain so much advantage by playing free Beelzemons that they could not keep up. In this format though, we're actually a bit more aggressive, and so these decks have kind of been falling off in terms of how many good matchups they have. But overall, I would say that in terms of the counters that are out there like Avenge Kidmon, etc., those are increasing, and so these decks are more known, and so because of that they're falling out of like tier 1.5 contention into just like actual rogue tier contention. And then finally we have Cherubi and Beelzemon in the same vein. I think Beelzemon is actually the king of tier 2. I do view him as a super powerful aggro deck, and I do think there are some fun ways you can build it that people have not been experimenting with, but overall I do think it's a bit one note. It's a bit easy to play around, and there are just decks that it cannot interact with, like D-Reaper or hybrid decks in general, and so it has to try to outpace those decks, and when it fails to do so, it just loses horribly. And then Cherubi is just untested, unproven, but I do think it's a good deck and worth considering, and we do have the inclusion of new things like Shu Chong Wong that can give you extra ways to sort of gain advantage, but because it's not a purple tamer, it's not immediately that great, but you could build the deck in a new way that can kind of like increase sort of the late game potential of your big Cherubi maybe Pinata Pop turn, and that's pretty cool. So I think there's only 2 black decks on here. My main man, Black War Greymon. It's technically a red deck, but for the purposes of this, it's a black deck. We have X Antibody, of course, and I think that's it. I didn't include things like Justimon or D-Brigade because, like I said, I have no idea what those decks look like, and I don't really think you're going to play against them if you go to a big tournament, so don't really worry about considering it for now. But if I had to just, off the top of my head, place these, I would say Black War Greymon is 1.5, and X Antibody is kind of like tier 2. Back when BT8 was like just going, X Antibody was super cool. Things like Orumon and Alphamon combo was so crazy. It eventually evolved into like Dorogoromon, Orumon Beatdown, to where you had like this really resilient high stack, and then you had tons of ways to control your opponent's board. Super awesome deck. And that's kind of like where X Antibody is staying. But like I said, things like Hybrid, things like Imperial, and things like just blatantly more fast decks are coming out of the woodwork right now. And so the removal that X Antibody was like bolstering just doesn't feel that great anymore. And if I want to play like a mid-rangey red/like black deck, I'm gonna play Black War Greymon. And that's where I'm sitting here with Black War Greymon is he's not only still the king of mid-range, he can still like duke it out with the best of them like Imperial, like Mastay, but all these hybrid decks that are coming out of the woodwork get absolutely dumpstered by him because you just delete all of their tamers and you can gain so much value off of just a single Black War Greymon that continues to be a house. I will say blue hybrid is a bit shaky because they have tons of ways to interact with your Black War Greymon regardless of their tamers or not, but all the other ones feel like pretty free matchups, especially things like yellow or green hybrid. On top of that, thanks to the inclusion of BT1 War Greymon that a lot of people have been doing in Black War Greymon decks, you have easy answers to more security focused decks like Mastodon Security Control and of course yellow hybrid, so that just really helps you out as well for guaranteeing game against the more stally archetypes of the format. Oh, and should I mention that a deck like Black War Greymon insanely counters D-Reaper, which at the beginning of EX2 was looking to be a terrifying deck, but because counters like this exist, maybe it's not so scary. That's it for black decks. Let's talk about blue decks, and we have quite a few. We've got blue hybrid themselves, Imperial. We have, I'll call it Leomon hybrid, but really we have like shenanigan blue hybrid. We have Armor Rush, and we have blue Jogress. So first things first, blue Jogress. I still don't really know what this deck does. Yes, Shakomon is a crazy card, and you know, playing like a blue-yellow hybrid deck that plays Shaco is cool. Playing like a Metal Garurumon Jogress deck that tries to turbo into this /Chimeramon is really cool. But besides a couple of like die-hard players that love these archetypes, I've never seen it do anything outside of them. And so it's tough for me to say, yes, this deck is actually great, but I don't know if it has good matchups anymore. And if you just play it over and over again, hopefully you'll see success on the local level, but in the big like Ultimate Cup Beyond level, I'm not sure it's anything higher than tier 2. Armor Rush, I'm kind of gonna put Armor Rush in a rogue category because I feel like Armor Rush, besides yellow hybrid, actually does really good against hybrid based strategies because you're essentially 2 different kinds of aggro decks, but one is immune to removal while the other one sort of dodges it by having only tamer cards in play. And so I wonder how that matchup shakes out. I think it's better for Armor Rush on average against like the regular hybrid decks of the world. Plus you do have access to really powerful blockers and stuff like Magna that can be really useful against the red hybrid decks of the world. And so I kind of do like it for that reason. It's still good against Imperial, and it can still dumpster on things like Mastemon or Bielstermon. So I could see it totally fitting into the rogue category where if things line up your way, you're winning an entire event with Armor Rush. And then let's do both blue hybrids together. So we have what I'll call Leomon blue hybrid, and then we'll have regular blue hybrid. In my opinion, blue hybrid is the king of 1.5, maybe even bottom of tier 1. I'll put it in here for now. But basically this and this are the same deck, except this is like pure, no joke, max consistency. And then this one is like, let's throw in Leomons, let's throw in the potential of Bond of Friendship and shenanigans, you know, on top of the amazing blue hybrid engine. So what these two things have going for them is they're just super solid. They're super consistent. They can shut down offensive turns like crazy thanks to the Korikakumon Tommy source strip engine. And we still have guaranteed ways to win by just having a bunch of tamers in play and guaranteeing guaranteeing damage, because besides Mastemon and Black War Greymon, there really isn't any deck that interacts with Tamers so well right now. And so it's just easy ways for you to kind of guarantee game while also gaining a ton of advantage in the process. This could go lower as we go through the rest of the video, but for now I'll leave it up here. And then finally we have the high roll king himself, Imperial. I mean, you've heard so many people say it, and I'm going to say it again right now. If this deck gets its god hand and doesn't get punished by security checks, I don't think there's a single deck that can defeat you, and that's kind of crazy. You know, we saw the inclusion of a ton of option cards, of security control decks, of Bielstermon shenanigans in BT8, because they were the decks that could play the most answers to things like XVmon, Pyildramon, and not actually get punished for it. So yeah, this deck is just so crazy, but I do think it's like the worst of the tier 1 decks. Like, I think Blue Hybrid is actually better than Imperial. And so I feel like I should actually leave Blue Hybrid in tier 1 for that reason. I will say there is some cute new text happening thanks to EX2. Things like offensive plugin A for plus security attack on your pile or your late game fighter modes is really cool. The inclusion of the Labramon to gain a memory when you swing with your XVmon is really cool. And I think I've seen more people try to include techier things like Shiva, and I want to say Nidhoggmon, which I'm personally in love with playing really cool techie one-ofs like that in a deck that's so like fluid and can draw so many cards. So there are a lot of fun things you can do with Imperial right now that people are doing and seeing success with. So that's just like super cool. So like maybe Imperial is like on par with Blue Hybrid, but I personally like Blue Hybrid more. But I guess for the sake of like popularity, I'll put Imperial above Blue Hybrid. All right, with the blue decks down, let's talk about the red decks. And I think we have only two here. We have Gallantmon and we have Red Hybrid / Ancient OTK. Let's start off with Ancient OTK. I actually think it's probably the king of the rogue decks. I mean, like when your entire deck revolves around praying your opponent doesn't have a Digimon with blocker in its text, it can kind of feel a little silly to say, oh yes, that's the most consistent deck of the format. But it really is true. If you're fighting against a deck that doesn't have blockers and you just get your stack and can deal 8 guaranteed damage and then top it off with a blitz, it's kind of impossible for decks to beat you. It's like the ultimate helmet deck. It can just win you games, and we saw a lot of people jamming it at the beginning of the format, and now we're just seeing the more diehard players stick with it, and they're still seeing tons of success. Chungman, back in BT7, you made an absolute monster of a deck that inspired so many. It's really cool, but I wouldn't put anything higher than Rogue because you have to have a lot of courage, I'll say, to play this deck. And then even so, if you fight against a single Black War Greymon or a Leomon, your day's just ruined. But Gallantmon's really interesting. Tons of removal, tons of ways to interact with your opponent's board. Takato is a crazy card that the more you get in play, the longer the turns go, the advantage just racks up. I love the inclusion of Crimson Mode. I love the existence of like the starter deck Gallantmon being a 3-cost evolution, which is kind of broken the more you think about it with this deck. And the overall way for this deck to sort of aggress while also getting rid of your opponent's board kind of gives it like BT5 Lord Nightmon vibes, and that's really cool. But like I said, and I've been saying, the format in EX2 has kind of been shifting away from like regular Digimon and kind of back to hybrids, and that's the one thing that Gallantmon kind of doesn't interact with very well. And so at the beginning of EX2, I probably would have put it in 1.5 just because of the good matchup spread, the popularity, and how strong I do think this deck is. But sadly, I do think it kind of got a raw deal with the way people chose to evolve their decks. And so I kind of want to put it next to its buddy, Blast Mode, and say, well, originally these decks seem really good, but it feels really hard if they fight against anything that interacts poorly with them, you know? Like, what is Bielstermon going to do against a hybrid deck? What's Gallantmon going to do against a hybrid deck? Kill them before they kill you, and that's not the easiest thing to do unless you can stack up all your plus security effects or get a super huge trash really quickly. So yeah, I'm kind of not into these as much as I was at the beginning of EX2, but they're still really solid decks. And of course, if you play with them very well, you could still do pretty well in big events. And that's why they're in this list to begin with, unlike things like Justamon, Pure Sakuya, or Mega Gargo. Okay, so I know that, you know, yellow is the next color in order down here, but let's just forget all the yellow decks that I have and instead talk about these two green decks, because we have two green decks to talk about. Been a while since that's happened. The first one is, of course, Pure Shivamon, and the second one is Terriermon Hybrid, or the deck that Russell Lepar used to win the most recent Ultimate Cup. Basically, it's a combination of really powerful Terrier plus Rapidmon cards alongside the Beetlemon green hybrid package to just kind of have this ultimate like mid-range slash like aggro beatdown deck. So let's get this one out of the way. Shivamon is bottom of tier 2. This is probably the worst deck in the game that people still play. In the future, if we ever see like a big option card focused deck, this might become something that's relevant in terms of pure Shiva. But in my opinion, Shivamon is a tech card. He is not the focus of a main deck, sadly. The other one, though, Terriermon Hybrid, I kind of want to put this in tier 1 because, like, in terms of hybrid decks, the green one always felt like, hey, I'm just as good as all the rest of them. Just give me a good engine. And thanks to the inclusion of Terriermon, Golden Rapidmon, and Calamon, it's really easy to gain advantage in this deck while also dealing damage, which is awesome. But like I said, this deck is not easy to use, and Russell put in 500 plus games with his original list, and you know, if that's what it takes to do well with this deck, I'm kind of remiss to put it anything higher than tier 1.5. Like, it's good. It has good matchups. It plays really cool. But to say it's tier 1 worthy just because it won once with someone who clearly knew more about that deck than anyone else ever is a tough sell for me to give. I like the deck. I think it is strong, and if you put in the time, you will see good performance. But if blue hybrid decks just switch back to playing Sayakomon in their main, you're just going to get dumpstered on anyways. So always keep that in mind. Okay. Yellow decks. Now, I have 4 yellow decks down here, but some of them are kind of like fake yellow decks in that they just play yellow cards in them. But, you know, the 2 main yellow decks we have are yellow Golden Rapidmon Hybrid and Lord Nightmon, specifically Lord Nightmon Sakuya, because thanks to the inclusion of EX2, we did get Sakuyamon, which is a good, you know, deck on her own, but I think she's most useful and most well played in a deck like Lord Nightmon, to where you can get a lot of value off of her restand effect. Now, with that said, I do think Lord Nightmon kind of falls in the Cherubimon camp, where essentially it's untested, but in theory it's really good given what else is doing really well in this format. I do think, though, that if you roll up against a Black War Greymon, a Mastamon, or even an Imperial that high rolls you, you are just kind of dead in the water no matter what. So unless someone really commits to doing well with this deck, I don't see it doing much of anything. So I'll put it down here in tier 2 alongside these other kind of like build tall and see what happened decks. Yellow Hybrid, though, is still a crazy strong deck. I mean, Jet Sylphie is a disgusting card, and until she gets either banned or restricted, I don't think this engine will ever be bad. It's just free recover, it's free resilience, and then it has now Golden Rapidmon, which is a really solid attacker slash extra form of board clear that can just gain you value every single turn. It does not die. I do think it's better than Imperial, but just barely. I do think Imperial, though, has a better chance of winning events given how many people choose to play it at the top tables. So take that as you will. I think all 3 of these can kind of interchange depending on who you are and what tournament you're playing in. And finally, the last 2 decks I want to talk about, we have Security Control and D-Reaper. Now, these decks don't have to play yellow cards. There are versions that play like red cards, black cards, etc. But I think the 2 most popular versions are like yellow D-Reaper that plays like Spiral Masquerade, Tack Retreat, and Holy Flame sometimes. And then we have like Security Control, which the new monstrosity is like 4 Mimis, yellow base, Chaos Degrade, Flame Hell Scythe to abuse your Magna Angemons, and then to tap to top it all off, we have things like Magna Kidmon at like 3 copies to just constantly reuse all your annoying cards and get even more removal into your deck, as well as extra bodies to help close out games. Security Control, while it does gain a lot and the new version looks so fun to use but not necessarily play against, I'm still gonna put it in the Rogue tier for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's still kind of awkward to use sometimes. Like, you can mismanage your resources and kind of get punished, but also hybrid decks are back and they're better than ever, and it still does not have a meaningful way to interact with tamer cards. And so your opponent can just be like, oh, you're at 4 security, evolve tamer swing, evolve tamer swing, evolve tamer swing, evolve tamer swing, evolve tamer swing. That's a very easy thing to do for a lot of these decks, and they can do it while also dodging some of your most crucial removal. It's not guaranteed by any means for a hybrid deck to always win, but it's definitely your worst couple of matchups, and there's a lot of them happening nowadays in this format. So I'm a bit remiss to be like, unless things go your way, I don't see Security Control working out, and that's the definition of the Rogue tier. And finally, we have D-Reaper, originally one of my favorite decks to come out of EX2. I'm kind of a sucker for like guaranteed resource slash like setup decks, and it's the epitome of that. You have Mother D-Reaper, who's this uninteractable resource, or at least uninteractable for certain colors, and the longer the game goes, the closer you get to your ultimate win con of just dropping a Big Daddy Reaper and winning the game. There are slow decks like Yellow Hybrid, Mass Demon, etc. that exist that you can just dumpster on sometimes if they can't actually aggress you quick enough. And then you have things like Ancient OTK or Blue Hybrid or Imperial that have a way to just out aggro you before you even get close to your big OTK turn. So I don't really know where to place Reaper, because when I would play with this deck, it feels invincible past like turn 5 or 6, but it's tough to get there, and things like Black War Greymon and Gallantmon are gaining in popularity, and they have ways to just straight up counter you. Also, playing against like heavy removal decks like Green Hybrid or even Gallantmon to an extent can be super awkward, because if they just delete everything that's in play that's not your mother, you're not actually gaining any aggressive tempo, and so you have to rely on a super big Reaper turn, which might not be enough unless you have like 8+ searchers in trash by the time you play it. So it can be super awkward to pilot D-Reaper well, and there's a ton of just like non-good matchups. Not necessarily bad ones, but just non-good. And for that reason, I kind of want to put it in the top of tier 2. I know this is like the EX2 tier EX2, but I just think it's the best place for me to go, because it truly feels like a difficult deck to do well with because of what is performing well in this format. And that's what I think tier 2 is. Like, because these decks are great, it's hard for these decks to be anything but okay. And there you guys go. That wraps up my tier list for EX2. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Peace.